A man saved a dog from drowning, but then he realized the truth. Now the roof was still leaky, but at least it was overhead. Daniel forced a smile, petting the dog's head. "We'll stay here a while," he murmured, "just until things cool down." The dog nudged his hand, eyes bright in the fading light. Daniel wondered if the pup missed having space to run around or other dogs to play with, but it still seemed guarded, occasionally perking its ears at distant forest noises. They were both on edge. Yet for a brief moment, a sense of camaraderie steadied Daniel. They'd face this together. Days slipped into a routine. Daniel woke at dawn, took the dog out for a walk by the lake, boiled instant coffee on the antique stovetop. He spent time clearing fallen branches, patching holes in the cabin. He found a battered generator in the shed and coaxed it to life, giving the cabin a more reliable electricity supply. The dog followed him everywhere, sometimes bounding happily after squirrels, though it never strayed far from Daniel's side. There was an almost pleasant simplicity to this life. Cut off from the hum of civilization, Daniel felt a measure of calm he hadn't known before. He even started tinkering on his laptop, writing in a journal about his experiences, though part of him worried it could be traced. He used a patchy phone signal to check in with, but never got a response. Anxiety simmered beneath the peaceful surface. Still, for all the worry, the dog flourished in the open air, eating heartily, sleeping peacefully, showing glimpses of real joy. Then one cool afternoon, while Daniel was outside chopping wood near the cabin, a crow cawed overhead. The dog, who'd been romping near the tree line, froze, ears erect. Daniel barely noticed until he sensed the pup's tension. "What is it, boy?" he called. The dog's ears pinned back, fur bristling. A low growl escaped its throat. Slowly it backed toward Daniel, gaze fixed on something deeper in the forest. Daniel set the axe aside and reached for the dog's collar. "Come here," he whispered. The dog retreated, pressing against Daniel's legs. Silence blanketed the trees, broken only by the crow's distant call. Daniel's stomach tightened. He peered into the shadows, heart pounding. At first he saw nothing but rustling leaves. Then a flicker of movement, a shape, a man, stood partially obscured behind a stand of pines. Daniel's breath hitched. This was private land. No hikers should be here, especially not this close to the cabin. He was about to shout when the figure melted back into the foliage, vanishing. Daniel's heart drummed in his ears, adrenaline surging. "Hey!" he yelled, voice echoing. No reply, just the hush of the forest. He scanned the tree line for any sign of the intruder but found none. The dog whimpered, pawing at Daniel's pant leg, urging him inside. Daniel didn't argue. He grabbed the axe in trembling hands, hustled the dog into the cabin and bolted the door. He peered out the windows, scanning the dim forest. No movement, but the prickling sense of being watched lingered. If they'd found him, there was no question. He had to leave. Anxiety gripped him. The dog paced restlessly, tail tucked low. The brand on its shoulder seemed to stand out starkly, as if newly inflamed. "Easy," Daniel murmured, swallowing hard. "We'll figure this out." He gathered his essentials, loaded the truck again, breathing fast. But was it safer to run or stay hidden here? If they'd discovered the cabin, the roads out might be watched. He glanced at the dog, who was whining softly. At that moment, Daniel's phone vibrated. He fumbled for it, hoping it was. A text message from an unknown number read, "Stop running. Give us the dog and this ends." Veer spiked. A new message followed. "Your friend is gone. You're next." Daniel's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. He stared at the screen, horror swirling. Could really be gone, or was this a bluff? Either way, these people had found him. They wanted the dog. Forcing back terror, he typed a reply, "Who are you?" No answer. He tried calling, no ring, no connection. He paced the cabin, mind racing. Running blindly could lead them into a trap. Staying put might be equally dangerous. The dog pressed itself against him, trembling. Daniel looked into its eyes, feeling an echo of the pup's fear. Then, a fierce determination blazed. He refused to let these monsters win. They'd nearly drowned this creature once. Daniel wouldn't give them another shot. Chest heaving, he considered his options. There was an old shortwave radio in the shed, left by his grandfather. Maybe he could contact someone for help, an old local ranger he once knew. If the phone lines were compromised, maybe the radio wasn't. Desperate for any advantage, Daniel grabbed a flashlight and the dog, heading to the shed. Inside, among rusted tools and half-rotted tarps, he found the radio unit. It was dusty and dented. He flicked switches, turned knobs. Static crackled. He tried various frequencies, calling for anyone on an open channel. Nothing but bursts of static. He spent nearly an hour adjusting the antenna, fueled by hope and dread in equal measure. Finally, a faint voice broke through. "Port your call, repeat, who is this?" Relief and excitement flooded him. "Hello, I'm out at Lake Williston, near the old cabin. I need help, someone's after me. My name is Daniel, please, can you contact the police or—" Before he could finish, the cabin's generator sputtered, the shed light flickered. Then the radio died. "No, no, no," Daniel shouted, frantically turning knobs. The generator whirred again, but the radio stayed dead. A faint smoke wisped from the back panel. He smelled burnt circuitry. It was shot. The dog whimpered, as if sensing the moment's gravity. Daniel banged a fist on the dusty counter, frustration boiling. He'd been so close. Now the only line of contact was gone. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. Darkness would soon cloak the forest, and with it, who knew what these people would try? He tried to calm his racing heart. The nearest town was about 20 miles south. Daniel could attempt to drive there under cover of night, contacting the authorities in person. But if these people had vehicles and were already near, he might be spotted. Or ambushed. He looked at the dog, who gazed back, trust shining in its eyes despite the fear. Daniel swallowed hard. "I won't lose you, I won't." At last he decided. They'd make a stand at the cabin tonight, keep all the lights off, remain silent, hidden. If no one came, they'd slip out at first light and head straight for the sheriff's station in the next county. Maybe the local cops would brush him off, but he'd at least try. That's what would have wanted. Back inside the cabin, Daniel pulled the heavy wooden table against the door as a makeshift barricade. He checked the windows, grabbed his father's old hunting rifle from the closet. He wasn't fond of guns, but it might deter an intruder if it came to that. He loaded it with shaky hands, heart pounding. The dog watched, tail tucked, occasionally whining at the flicker of Daniel's flashlight. Then they waited. Hours passed in tense silence. Daniel sat on the floor beside the dog, rifle across his lap, watching the windows. Outside, the forest murmured with night sounds, crickets chirping, branches creaking in the breeze. The dog's ears flicked every so often, catching a distant noise. The brand on its shoulder glinted faintly in the moonlight. Daniel's arms felt like lead, exhaustion pressing on him, but he refused to close his eyes. Just after midnight, the dog stiffened, a low growl vibrating its body. Daniel's pulse leaped. Through the cracked window, moonlight lit the clearing. At first, Daniel saw nothing. Then from the tree line, multiple figures emerged, stepping carefully. They moved in a coordinated manner, spaced out. Daniel's breath went ragged. He counted 4, maybe 5. Each wore dark clothing, some with masks. Their silhouettes gilded closer, surrounding the cabin like predators. One carried something long, maybe a rifle. Another had a flashlight, shining a narrow beam at the cabin's walls. Daniel's heart hammered so violently he thought it might burst. Fear threatened to freeze him, but the dog's soft whimper spurred him to act. He stood slowly, rifle at the ready, every nerve on edge. He considered flicking on the cabin lights, but that might make him an easier target. Instead, he pressed his back against the wall beside the window, the muzzle of the gun pointed outward. A voice, muffled but audible, called from outside, "Daniel, we know you're in there. Come out and bring the dog. Let's make this easy on everyone." Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing down a surge of panic. He peered through the window's edge, saw a tall figure with a bullhorn. The man repeated, "No one wants any harm done." "You're trespassing on private property, friend. We can settle this." Trembling, Daniel shouted back, "This is my family's land. You're the trespassers. Leave us alone." Another figure stepped forward, shining a flashlight at the window. Daniel ducked, the dog pressed to his side. The man with the bullhorn spoke again, voice cold. "That dog belongs to us. We have the paperwork. You're in possession of stolen property." Daniel's eyes burned with fury. "You tried to kill him. He's not your property." "We don't want to hurt you, Daniel," the voice insisted. "But that dog is critical to our operation. Hand it over and you can walk away." Daniel's mind reeled. He wondered if the group had connections to law enforcement. If so, calling the cops might do nothing. Right now, his only ally was a battered old rifle and a terrified dog. Adrenaline surged, carrying a strange clarity. He'd never been one for heroics, but this dog was a life he had sworn to protect. He refused to hand it over to those monsters. Gritting his teeth, he shouted, "Never." Silence. Then the bullhorn voice sounded again, bored and disappointed. "A shame, Daniel. We gave you a chance." The flashlight beams started converging on the door and windows. Daniel's heart pounded. Suddenly, two figures rushed toward the cabin. One slammed something heavy against the door. The wood groaned, but the table braced it. Daniel fired a warning shot through the window. The gun's recoil nearly knocked him off balance. The thunderous crack shattered the stillness. The dog yelped, pressing itself to the floor. The intruders dove aside, cursing. The night came alive with tension. Daniel's hands shook violently. He'd fired a gun at living beings, a terrifying first. But if it scared them off, maybe no one had to die. Outside, one intruder shouted angrily, "He's armed." Another responded, "We'll flush him out." A whoosh of something ignited outside, and Daniel's nose caught the acrid smell of smoke. Fear spiked, they might burn the cabin. Adrenaline spurred him to action. He bolted across the room, scanning for an escape route. If they set the place on fire, they'd either trap him or force him out. The dog barked in alarm. Flames danced at the edge of one window as a Molotov cocktail crashed against the wall. Daniel stomped on a small flame that flickered under the sill. Another bottle shattered against the porch. Smoke seeped in. The door shuddered with repeated blows. Glass from a side window exploded inward. Daniel coughed, eyes watering, hearing the dog's panicked bark. Chest burning, he realized the cabin was quickly becoming a death trap. The intruders wanted to corner him, maybe kill him, and definitely take the dog. He refused to let that happen. Rifle in hand, dog at his side, he dashed toward the back bedroom. There was a small window there that faced the forest. He hid open. Smoke billowed behind him, the crackle of flames rising. "Come on," Daniel rasped to the dog. He placed the rifle on the sill, then hoisted the pup through the window, letting it drop gently outside. Next, he grabbed the rifle, swung one leg through, ducking to avoid the frame. Flames licked the hallway behind him. The dog whimpered, urging him on. Wincing at the heat, Daniel slid out of the window, landing on soft pine needles. He scrambled to his feet, the dog pressed to his leg. Heart pounding, he heard voices on the other side of the cabin. Smoke curled skyward. The intruders might not realize he'd slipped out. He seized the chance, sprinting into the darkness with the dog in tow. They stumbled through undergrowth, branches scratching at their clothes. In the distance, he heard someone shout, "He's out, go around." Panic propelled Daniel deeper into the forest. The dog kept pace, panting, fear shining in its eyes. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets zipping through branches. Daniel flinched, forging onward. The darkness of the pines swallowed them, yet the intruders' flashlights bobbed in the distance, closing in. At last, he stumbled onto a narrow path that sloped downhill. Pine needles carpeted the ground, muffling his footsteps. He risked a glance over his shoulder, flashlight still behind but with some distance now. The dog whined. He paused, chest heaving, scanning for a place to hide. The path curved ahead. To the left was a steep drop into a rocky ravine, likely leading to the lakeshore below. If they cornered him, he might have to climb down. An explosion shattered the night. probably the cabin's generator catching fire. A wave of heartbreak struck him as he realized that old family place, all his hopes for sanctuary, was now cinders. Rage flared at the men who'd done this. Daniel clenched his fists. The dog nudged him gently as if to remind him they had to move. They scrambled off the path heading down the slope. Rocks crumbled underfoot. One misstep and they'd tumble. Daniel gripped branches, steadied the dog. Voices closed in above. A flashlight beam lanced through the trees. Daniel ducked behind a fallen log, the dog trembling beside him. He heard them call out, "Split up. He's got the dog with him." Another gunshot rang out, bark splintering overhead. Daniel pressed a hand over the dog's muzzle to keep it from barking. Sweat beaded on his brow. They had to keep moving. He peered over the log. The intruders were spread out, scanning the slope. Daniel realized their advantage. They had the numbers, the vantage point, the firearms. He and the dog were pinned against the ravine. With no other choice, Daniel led the pup downward, half sliding on loose gravel. The slope grew steeper, the ground slick with moss. Twice Daniel nearly lost his footing. The dog, more agile, stepped carefully. The lights above weaved to and fro, searching. Suddenly, the slope ended in a sheer drop. Daniel skidded to a halt, pebbles clattering over the edge, bouncing into darkness. He peered down. It was at least a 20-foot drop to the lakeshore. He heard the water lapping at rocks below. Jumping was risky. The dog gave a small whine, uncertain. A voice barked from above, "I see him." A flashlight beam caught Daniel's back. Gunshots erupted, forcing him to flatten against the ground. The dog yelped, ears ringing. Fear hammered Daniel's heart as bullets chipped rocks near the cliff's edge. They would be on him in seconds. He turned to the dog, eyes burning with tears. He couldn't let them have it. Couldn't let them harm this precious creature that he had saved. The words tumbled out, raw and urgent. "You'll have to trust me." Before common sense could stop him, Daniel scooped the dog in his arms. Clutching it tight, he leaped over the edge. For a frozen moment, he felt weightless. The dog pressed against him, mouth open in a silent whine. The wind roared in Daniel's ears, heart pounding with terror. Then he hit the water feet first, a jarring impact that stabbed every bone. He sank into the icy lake, arms locked around the dog, bubbles bursting from his mouth in a scream cut short by the freezing water. The dog struggled, flailing, but Daniel kept hold, kicking desperately for the surface. Above, flashlights bobbed at the cliff's edge. Muffled voices shouted. Daniel broke the surface, gasping in a lungful of cold air. The dog's muzzle emerged, sputtering. Daniel swam for the shadows near the rocky shore, ignoring the fiery ache in his muscles. Water lapped around them. Gunshots echoed overhead, but it was unlikely they could see him in the darkness. Heart hammering, Daniel groped for a foothold on the jagged rocks, pulling himself and the dog out of the water. The cold night air bit at his soaked clothes. The dog shook violently, coughing. Daniel placed a trembling hand on its flank, relieved to feel the dog breathing. They huddled behind a large boulder at the water's edge, listening. The intruders remained on the cliff, beams skittering across the lake's surface. Daniel sank to his knees, chest heaving, water dripping from his hair and clothes. The dog pressed close, eyes wide with fear. He realized they were in the same position as the day he rescued this pup, both soaked, terrified, on the brink of death. Yet again, here they were, fighting for their lives. He forced slow, shallow breaths, hoping the night would cloak them. Eventually, the flashlights above retreated, the voices growing distant. Perhaps they assumed Daniel wouldn't survive the jump, or they planned to circle around. Daniel waited, adrenaline thrumming, for an hour or more, though it felt like eternity. Finally, the forest went silent once more. Cold seeped into his bones. He realized they had to keep moving. They couldn't risk these people finding a way down. With a grim determination, he waded along the shoreline, hugging the rocks, the dog stumbling beside him. His limbs were numb, pain radiating from every joint. Water dripped down his collar. The dog's fur stuck to its body. Daniel whispered encouragement, voice trembling. The brand on the pup's shoulder glistened under the moonlight, an ugly reminder of what they were running from. At length they found a narrow path leading away from the shore, twisting around the base of the cliff. Daniel followed it, exhaustion warring with the primal urge to survive. Every step felt like a small miracle. He had no idea where it led, only that it took them farther from the cabin and those men. If they could just get to a road, maybe hitch a ride to a police station in another county. They stumbled on until the sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn chasing away the stars. Daniel's energy was spent, and the dog limped on its injured paw. They created a small rise, revealing a dirt trail that sloped down to a deserted back road. Daniel's heart soared with cautious hope. He hurried forward, stumbling, but froze at the sight of headlights approaching along that narrow strip of asphalt. Dawn's pale glow revealed a black SUV creeping slowly as though searching. Daniel's breath caught. Could it be the intruders, or maybe just some early traveler? He couldn't risk it. He and the dog darted behind a thicket, hearts pounding, waiting for the vehicle to pass. It paused, engine idling, headlights sweeping the roadside. Daniel's stomach twisted. Then, after a tense moment, the SUV rumbled on, disappearing around a bend. He exhaled shakily. The presence of that SUV confirmed they were still being hunted, but at least he knew they were close to a road. If he followed it carefully, maybe he'd find a town soon enough. The dog licked his hand as if sensing the plan. Daniel gave a faint nod. "Let's keep moving, we'll find help." Their journey continued, a painful trek along the road's edge, hidden by the trees. Every rumble of an engine set Daniel's nerves on edge. Twice, they dove for cover as black SUVs passed, scanning the area. These people were relentless, with resources that dwarfed Daniel's. Doubt gnawed at him. Would they ever escape? Yet the dog kept going, bravely hobbling on, refusing to give up. Each time Daniel's spirit wavered, the pup's determined glance spurred him onward. The memory of nearly losing this dog once steeled Daniel's resolve. He'd fight for it, no matter the cost. By midday they were both parched, limbs shaking with fatigue. Daniel spotted a sign for a ranger station a few miles ahead. Relief soared. A ranger station might have a radio, or at least someone official. This could be the break they needed. He followed the sign onto a dirt track. The dog limped at his side, panting. Clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain. Soon, the station's green roof came into view, a squat, single-story cabin with a small tower. A battered pickup was parked out front. Daniel's heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Finally, a place for help. He approached cautiously, scanning for signs of danger. The dog's tail wagged hopefully, though it remained tense. Daniel pushed open the door, calling out in a hoarse voice, "Hello, Ranger, anyone?" A middle-aged woman in a ranger uniform emerged from a side room, eyes widening at Daniel's disheveled, soaking form and the dog's exhausted stance. "My goodness, are you all right?" Daniel nearly collapsed with relief. I need help. There are people after me and my dog. They're armed. They burned down my cabin." His voice cracked, tears threatened. Alarmed, the ranger motioned him inside. "Come in, sit down, let me get you water." She grabbed a radio from her desk. "I'll call for backup." Daniel sank into a chair, the dog curling at his feet, trembling. The ranger pressed the radio button, voice calm but urgent. "Ranger Post 17 requesting immediate assistance, possible armed suspects in the vicinity. Over." A crackle, then a dispatch answered, promising to send law enforcement. She turned to Daniel. "I'm Ranger Beck. Tell me everything." He recounted the events in broken spurts, finding the dog, the brand's warning, the attack on the cabin. Beck's expression shifted from concern to horrified. She gently examined the dog's brand. "This is definitely not a normal livestock or hunting mark," she murmured. "I've never seen anything like it." They gave the dog water, and Daniel sipped from a cup, body shaking with residual fear and fatigue. Warmth from a small space heater washed over them. For the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of safety. Beck was professional, armed, and reinforcements were on the way. Then the door burst open. The dog barked, hackles raised. In stepped a tall man wearing a crisp, neatly pressed uniform. Daniel froze, confusion swirling. He expected a local sheriff or trooper, but this man's uniform bore no recognizable insignia, just a dark patch on the shoulder, reminiscent of some federal agency. Beck turned startled. "Can I help you?" Her words choked off as he pulled a handgun with lightning speed, pointing it at her chest. She paled, stepping back. Daniel's heart thundered in panic. Two more men in black uniforms followed, one pointing a weapon at Daniel. The dog growled, lips curled. Ranger Beck's eyes flicked to Daniel, frantic. "Who are you?" "This is a restricted area." The first man, expression cold, said, "We'll take it from here, Ranger. Don't make a sound." Daniel trembled. The group had arrived faster than any official backup could. The same group that wanted the dog. They'd beaten the police here, possibly intercepting the radio call. Everything crashed down in a wave of terror. The man advanced, muzzle trained on Beck. "Hand over your sidearm." She hesitated, face drawn with fear. Another man lunged forward, forcing the gun from her holster. Beck raised her hands in surrender. Daniel's mind whirled, searching for an opening, but the second man's gun pinned him in place. The dog snarled, but Daniel feared it would be shot if it attacked. "Daniel," the first man said, voice dripping with authority. "We've come for the dog. Surrender it now and no one else gets hurt." Daniel's throat constricted. He glanced at Beck, her eyes pleaded with him. She had no illusions about the brutality these men were capable of. Daniel's chest heaved. "You'll kill him," he croaked. The man smirked. "We only want what's ours." Ranger Beck, trembling, spoke up. "You can't do this. The police will be here soon. This is kidnapping, assault." A swift backhand from the man's pistol whipped across her face. Beck staggered, blood splattering her lip. Daniel shouted in fury, half rising from his chair, but the second man aimed at him. He froze, helpless rage boiling in his veins. "Where's your phone, Ranger?" the first man demanded. She gestured weakly to the desk. He snatched it, hurling it to the ground, smashing it under his boot. Then he tossed a zip tie to the second man, who grabbed Beck's wrists, restraining her. The dog barked furiously, tugging on Daniel's pant leg, as if urging him to run. But there was nowhere to go. The ringleader leveled his gaze at Daniel. "We'll take the dog now, and as for you, we'll see." Terror spiked. Daniel glanced at the dog, whose eyes brimmed with panic and trust. Something in Daniel snapped. He couldn't hand over this creature to be tortured again. His mind raced, a flicker of a plan forming. They hadn't searched him thoroughly. His father's rifle was lost in the scramble, but Daniel had a small hunting knife strapped to his belt. He moved slowly, hands in the air, feigning surrender. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll give you the dog." The man nodded, stepping closer. "Smart move now." With a sudden burst, Daniel lunged, grabbing the muzzle of the man's gun and shoving it aside. A shot rang out, blowing a chunk off the desk. Ranger Beck screamed. The second man whirled, but the dog leaped at him, jaws snapping. The intruder stumbled, weapon firing wildly into the ceiling. Daniel wrestled with the first man, adrenaline surging. He swung the hunting knife from his belt, slicing across the man's arm. The intruder roared in pain. "Run!" Daniel shouted to Beck, who scrambled toward a side door, hands still tired but determined. The dog clung to the second man's arm, teeth sunk in his forearm. He howled, smashing the dog against the wall, trying to dislodge it. Daniel's rage flared. He plunged forward, tackling the second man, knocking him down. The dog released its grip, whimpering in pain. The third intruder rushed from the doorway, gun raised. Daniel ducked behind a table, heart hammering. Bullets raked the wooden tabletop, splinters flying. Through the barrage, Daniel heard the hiss of static from the Ranger's radio. Possibly law enforcement was still on the line. Maybe they heard gunshots, but they were still minutes away, or hours for all Daniel knew. "Hold your fire," the first man yelled. "We need the dog alive." The bullets stopped. Daniel used the brief lull to grab the dog, half dragging it behind the desk. The pup was bleeding from a gash on its side. Fury churned in Daniel's chest. Another shot exploded, pinging off a metal filing cabinet. Daniel huddled, trying to shield the dog with his body. His mind raced, searching for a way out. Then an unexpected crash. Ranger Beck had rammed a shelf into the men from behind, sending supplies clattering. One intruder staggered, gun knocked from his hand. She flung herself at him, legs bounding in a desperate attempt to stop the violence. The man shoved her back viciously, but her interference bought Daniel a moment. With a jolt of determination, Daniel burst from cover, brandishing the knife. He slashed at the second man, who reeled away, blood staining his sleeve. The third man, startled, swung the butt of his gun at Daniel's head. Pain exploded across Daniel's temple. He stumbled, vision spinning, but refused to go down. He caught hold of the man's wrist, twisting with every ounce of strength. A crack, a scream. The pistol clattered to the floor. Breathing ragged, Daniel turned to see the first man had forced back to the ground at gunpoint. "Stand down!" he roared, pressing the muzzle to her head. Daniel froze, heart lurching. The dog growled, uncertain. Blood dripped from Daniel's temple into his eyes, stinging. Adrenaline thrummed. He clutched the knife, but any move now could be fatal for Beck. "That's enough," the man hissed. "Give me the dog." Daniel's mind whirred. If Beck might live, but the dog would be doomed. If he fought, Beck could die. It was an impossible choice, and the panic thundered in his skull. The dog gave a frightened whine, gaze darting between Daniel and the pinned ranger. Time slowed. He had to gamble. He gripped the knife, ready to charge. But the dog abruptly stepped forward, limping, placing itself in front of Daniel. A sense of calm seemed to emanate from it, as if it somehow understood the gravity of the moment. The intruder sneered, "Good. The dog's giving itself up." The pup's eyes locked onto Daniel's. For an instant, Daniel saw something deeper in those soulful irises, an intelligence, a plea. Then the dog slowly advanced toward the armed man, tail low but unwavering. Beck sobbed quietly, powerless. The gun shook in the man's hand. Daniel's heart pounded, every fiber of his being screaming not to let the dog go. But how could he ensure Beck's survival otherwise? Suddenly, the dog leaped, jaws snapping at the man's wrist. The gun fired, deafening. Beck scrambled free, the bullet missing her by inches. The man bellowed in pain, the dog's teeth locked onto his forearm. Fury twisted the intruder's face. He swung the muzzle around, pressing it against the dog's flank to fire at point-blank range. "No!" Daniel roared. A surge of desperation propelled him. He slammed into the man, driving him to the floor. The gun went off, the shot muffled, and the dog yelped. Daniel felt hot blood spatter across his hands. Whether it was the man's or the dog, he didn't know. They crashed into a wooden desk, splintering it. Another shot tore through the air. Daniel smelled cordite, felt the searing heat graze his shoulder, but adrenaline numbed the pain. He hammered the knife hilt against the man's temple. Once, twice, until the intruder slumped. The dog stumbled away, whining in agony. Meanwhile, Beck wrestled with the second man who had dropped his gun. She kicked him hard in the gut, freeing herself. The third intruder, seeing the carnage, snatched his weapon from the floor and bolted through the door. A moment later, an engine roared. Daniel guessed he was fleeing or going for reinforcements. Silence crashed down. The station's interior was ravaged. Smashed furniture, bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor. Daniel sagged against the counter, chest burning. He spotted the dog lying on its side, flank bleeding from a gunshot wound. His heart twisted in horror. "No, no, no." He crawled to the pup, hands trembling. The dog gazed at him with half-lidded eyes, breath shallow. Ranger Beck dragged herself upright, wincing at her bound wrists. She used a broken shard of glass to slice the zip tie, then collapsed to her knees by Daniel's side. Blood trickled from her lip, her face swollen from the blow. She placed a trembling hand on the dog's wound. "We need a first aid kit," she gasped, tears in her eyes. Daniel's vision blurred with panic. The pup whined, eyes pleading. Beck scrambled, found a kit, rummaging for gauze, disinfectant. Daniel pressed cloth to the wound, hot blood seeping through. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, voice cracking. "Stay with me." The dog twitched, the brand on its shoulder standing out in bright relief. Daniel's mind screamed in protest. After all they'd been through, after surviving the drowning, the chase, were they to lose now? With Beck's help, he bandaged the wound as best he could, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the gauze. The dog's breathing was shallow, its eyes closing. Daniel felt tears slide down his cheeks. He didn't care who saw. "Don't die," he pleaded. "I'm here, I won't let you go." He pressed his forehead to the dog, feeling the pup's heartbeat flutter beneath his palm. "Hang on, buddy," he whispered. "You fought so hard." Ranger Beck radioed desperately for medical evacuation, her voice choked with urgency. A garbled reply came back. Help was coming. But would it be in time? Daniel stared into the dog's weary eyes, memory flashing of that first rescue, the pup's terror in the water, their nights in the cabin. He realized how deeply this dog had changed him, giving him purpose, hope, a sense that he could do right by someone. And now the dog lay bleeding in his arms. Anguish tore through him. Then the dog blinked, letting out a soft whimper. Somehow it mustered a feeble lick to Daniel's hand, as though comforting him. Daniel inhaled a shaky breath, a surge of defiance rising in him. "No matter what happens," he murmured, "you're not alone, I promise." It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only minutes before sirens wailed in the distance. A swarm of local police arrived, followed by an ambulance. The chaotic swirl of uniforms, flashing lights, and shouted orders filled the station. The intruders who were still unconscious were taken into custody. Ranger Beck, bruised but alive, directed paramedics to the dog. Daniel hovered, refusing to leave the pup's side as they loaded it onto a stretcher, hooking it to an oxygen line. He gripped the dog's paw gently, tears streaming, praying in a way he never had before. The ambulance sped off, siren piercing the early afternoon air. Daniel found himself in a patrol car behind it, the urgent lights reflecting off wet pavement. Rain had started to fall again, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the dog's fate. Daniel clenched his fists, every muscle trembling from exhaustion and dread. He had no idea what awaited them at the hospital, nor how deep the conspiracy around this dog ran. But one fact burned in his chest. He would do anything, absolutely anything, to save this dog. When they arrived, paramedics rushed the pup into the emergency veterinary unit, with Daniel stumbling in behind. The bright overhead lights, the smell of antiseptic, the swirl of activity, it took him back to the night he found the dog. Only this time the stakes felt even higher, the wound more severe. A veterinarian and a team of techs surrounded the dog, hooking it up to IVs, preparing for surgery. Someone gently ushered Daniel out of the room, where he collapsed into a waiting chair, burying his face in his hands. Blood stained his shirt. He barely registered that an officer was asking him questions. He numbly gave what answers he could, voice hollow. Everything else was secondary to the dog's survival. Time was a blur. He hardly noticed Ranger Beck, bandaged and walking gingerly, sitting beside him in the waiting area. She placed a tentative hand on his shoulder. "They said the bullet didn't hit any vital organs," she murmured. "He's strong, Daniel. He'll pull through." Daniel couldn't speak, tears streaking his face. He'd never felt this depth of emotion. The dog had become part of his soul, filling a void he hadn't realized was so deep. The possibility of losing that connection sliced him raw. Hours ticked by, a slow torture. Officers milled around, trying to piece together the story of the armed men. Beck gave her statement, emphasizing how they threatened both her and Daniel. Some men had been taken into custody, but some, like the one who fled, remained at large. A detective approached Daniel, but Beck gestured for him to wait. For once, the system granted Daniel a moment to breathe. Finally, a vet tech emerged, pulling off bloody gloves. She beckoned Daniel, his heart hammered. "Is he?" She offered a tired but reassuring smile. "We removed the bullet and repaired the damage." He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable for now. We'll keep him here under observation." A sob of relief escaped Daniel's lips. Beck squeezed his shoulder, tears shining in her own eyes. The tech added gently, "He'll need time to heal, physical therapy, maybe some surgeries down the line, but we're hopeful." Daniel wiped his face, nodding fervently. Thank you so much." "You can see him soon," she said, stepping away. He nearly collapsed into the chair, relief flooding through him. Ranger Beck let out a shaky laugh. "We made it," she said softly. "Both of you." Daniel exhaled a trembling breath. The horrors of the last few days rushed through him like a flood. Yes, they made it. But the fight might not be over. The people who wanted the dog, some were arrested, but who knew how deep their network ran. For now, though, the dog was alive. That was enough for this moment. A week later, Daniel sat by the dog's kennel in a high-security veterinary facility. They'd moved the pup to a location with better protection and round-the-clock police presence. Ranger Beck had pulled strings, ensuring the dog was a priority witness of sorts, evidence of cruelty and illegal experimentation. Daniel spent his days in that small room, softly talking to the pup, whose bandages were changed regularly. The dog still winced in pain when it moved, but its eyes brightened when it saw Daniel. The brand remained a stark reminder of all it had endured. Law enforcement was building a case against the individuals responsible, some of whom had ties to black market breeding rings and rumored ties to more sinister ventures. The men who survived gave minimal information, but it was enough to confirm warnings. As for his fate remained unconfirmed, though the authorities suspected the worst. Daniel struggled with survivor's guilt, but the dog's presence grounded him. He promised himself that once the pup recovered, they would start a new chapter, one free from fear, living in a place where they could both heal. The dog had saved Daniel just as much as Daniel had saved it. Perhaps that was the truth that cut deepest. In rescuing this dog from drowning, Daniel had found something he didn't realize he was missing, a reason to believe in hope again. One afternoon, as a soft beam of sunlight filtered through the facility window, Daniel reached through the kennel bars, scratching behind the dog's ears. The pup let out a contented sigh, leaning into his touch. "You fought so hard," Daniel murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You never gave up, neither of us did, and we're still here." A tear slipped down his cheek, but this time it was a tear of gratitude and release. The dog gazed at him, eyes full of love and trust, as though to say, "Yes, we're still here together." In that unspoken moment, Daniel realized that no matter the horrors lurking in the past or the shadows that might haunt the future, their bond stood unbreakable. He had saved a dog from drowning, only to discover the deeper rescue was mutual. And that knowledge would guide him forward, a reminder that sometimes, when we save another, we are also saving ourselves. The end of their nightmare wasn't a perfect resolution, nor a miraculous happily ever after. Scars would remain, both on the dog's body and in Daniel's mind. There would be court cases, therapy sessions, nights waking in a cold sweat. But there was life, and there was hope. And sometimes that's the greatest truth of all. Even in a world of cruelty and darkness, a single act of compassion can spark a light that refuses to be extinguished. As Daniel left the facility that day, the late afternoon sun warmed his back. He paused in the parking lot, turning his face to the sky. A sense of quiet awe filled him. He realized that real miracles aren't always explosive or grandiose. Sometimes, they happen in the hushed moments when we refuse to abandon someone in need, even if that someone has 4 legs and a wounded past. And once in a while, that quiet miracle changes everything, forging a bond that can never be broken, illuminating truths we never saw coming. He promised himself that tomorrow, and every day that followed, he'd return to that kennel, be there for the dog. And soon enough, when the pup was strong enough to walk out of that place on its own, they'd walk side by side into a future where each was the other's proof of what it truly means to be saved.